Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Google Hangout. I am Heidi Hanna, and it is my pleasure to welcome my good friend, Dr. Evian Gordon, who's going to be joining us today as we talk about peak performance, one of our mutually favorite topics to look at. So this chat in particular, we are looking at peak performance habits. And we wanted to tie this in with the current study that we're doing, looking inside the minds of successful entrepreneurs. So many of you who are going to be joining us are part of our EO family, which is Entrepreneurs Organization. And Evian and I are currently doing a study where we've invited 300 successful entrepreneurs to take the Mind-Brain Solutions brain assessment, which allows them to see their personal brain scores. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But what we thought would be good as a follow-up to that, if you have taken the study and you want to know kind of how to apply that and some great tips, we've come up with what we think are 3 very powerful training tips based on the work we've both done working with professional athletes as well as peak performers in business. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about Evian Gordon. The most important thing is he has become a very good friend of mine, but I did print out a little mini bio because I can never remember all of the great details. I got to know Dr. Gordon through My-Brain Solutions, which is a online training brain exercise platform, but it is also a whole lot more than that. He has the largest international database of brain-related research. He is the author of the Brain 1-2-4 model, which is an integrative neuroscience model that he's going to talk a little bit more about. He is currently doing research and providing amazing guidance with regards to how to treat brain imbalances such as addiction, depression, anxiety, coming out with some great studies on that. He also established brainrevolution.org, which is a nonprofit organization, and I happen to know he's busy finishing up his next book. He's published over 300 scientific papers, one of which soon will be co-authored by yours truly, and I am putting a lot of pressure on him to get that study done. It's looking at the impact of stress on cognitive performance, and we found some really interesting things that I'll be sure to share with you. So, on that quick note, I am going to just have a conversation with Dr. Gordon about peak performance. And, you know, we had a discussion about this, and it was really interesting. We both had a chance to work with elite performers. And for me personally, it's been life-changing to get to know Dr. Gordon and his work and My-Brain Solutions, because it's given me a personal framework. And in fact, even just lately, going through my own transition and trying to be more elite in my own day-to-day life, I've been waking up every morning and thinking, how should I respond so that my brain can be optimized? And I often say when I'm working with clients, before you think about what to do, think about who you want to be. And I guess I'm kind of already getting into tip number 1 without trying to, but perhaps the most important thing is having a framework of how the brain actually works, because so many of us forget that these 85 billion neurons are kind of calling the shots here. So, Evian, would you maybe share a little bit more about your Brain 1-2-4 model and why it's so important to have a framework to begin with?
Sure, thank you, Heidi, and it's just been such fun working with you. And you're one of my exemplars of peak performance in all ways, including your self-deprecation, which is very scary. Because it's kind of like true, but you so overcome it so quickly that you reflect one of the key things about peak performance. So I always start with the end in mind, and the 3 points that I'm going to try and share with you, sort of extracting from our Brain Resource International database, is that that we've really seen from a variety of, whether it's Fortune 500 companies or whether it's executives or peak performers in sports teams, that having a model is what differentiates a peak performer from I like to say dilettante, but some people sort of think that's a little bit of a put down. But I don't mean it as a put down. It just really is true. The second thing is that I want to talk about how to reconcile using a model effectively. And they are the scores that you are going to have access to if you do the My-Brain assessment. And the third thing is, and that leads to what to train, like what does it mean to train a more effective brain? So I want to just really talk about what is it about peak performers? How do they train differently? Why are they so different? Because from what I see in the database, they are so different. It's incredible. And then the last thing is, even in the decision making, what are the things in peak performers that make them different? So they are the three things: the model, the reconciler scores and training, and basically decision making. So I'll just briefly start off with the model. Why is a model so important? What makes an expert so different? And if you think about it, I love working with physicists as an integrationist in the brain, because the physicists, above all, I learned the most from in terms of having this essence of how things work, how the universe works, how basic laws of physics work. And it made me increase, and my background, by the way, was I did my PhD in serum lipids in cardiology before I switched to the brain. And even in cardiology, that simplicity, the elegance of having a pump that you really understand how the sinoatrial node triggers the rest and how the flow goes. It was just so empowering to have this frame of reference. The problem was that when you got to the brain, it was kind of overwhelming by the number of layers and the number of different kind of churches in the landscape of the mind, which is kind of still sad in a way, because it's such a privileged space. But it's changing, in that people are being called upon much more to really have validated and replicated data. So the longer...
I'm going to stop you for 1 second in case people missed that, because you said it quickly, and I think some people might not know what you mean. Different churches when it comes to studying the brain. So different philosophies where everyone's kind of siloed off into this is how the brain works, and we're not going to look at this other area of study.
The brain is such a fertile area where your belief can be validated by a little bit of self-confirming data, and then before you know it, you have some big name from some university, with all due respect, and it becomes a kind of fad, and the next thing we know, that's the gap. Causality is so difficult to prove, and so people, because the brain is so complicated, 85 billion highly interconnected neurons with 100 chemicals sloshing around, let alone all the different complexities within each of those 85 billion. So I'm not telling anybody anything they don't know. So the essence of the model that surprised us, and that I think is the first time this has been possible in history, to my knowledge, is that computational analysis has allowed us, and when I say us, there are many groups around the world who are doing this, have allowed us to distill both the scientific literature and big data. In our case, the one little innovation that I happened to do was standardize the data so that from all over the world you could capitalize on the power of statistics. And essentially what emerged is what I call the brain 1-2-4, that there's, in essence, it turns out, one organizing principle, and that is safety first. Now, it's easy to underestimate this. Peak performers don't. They know. If you do not make people feel safe, if you don't feel safe, all the rest is detail. If you do feel safe, your likelihood of actually pursuing rewards more effectively is enhanced. So that's one of 1-2-4, safety. Two is there's non-conscious and conscious modes. We all know about conscious. Verbal, detail, language. It's what we bias to believe, rational thinking. What's been underestimated, totally, is the power of cues. Unfortunately, the word non-conscious and cues have a baggage that's called emotion, and emotion has been seen as a woolly concept. It is not woolly at all. It is cues, body language cues, face cues, environmental cues that are very objective. They're just not verbal, but they can be studied and objectified very powerfully. And we were one of the first groups that showed these cues so rapidly that people couldn't see them on computer screens, where the refresh rates were so fast that you could literally show the stimuli without consciousness and see what impact it had on the brain. I won't be able to say much more than that, other than for those people who have not read the book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, I urge you to do so. It is just a snippet. Or just go to Google and look up non-conscious biases. It is breathtaking. I've done it many times, and each time I lose my breath. So
also add to that too, just as a follow-up, that for people looking for more information in that area, one of my fascinations right now is negativity bias. And we could do a whole conversation, perhaps we'll do a follow-up on that. But for people who want more information about this, just send me a note, send me an email to Heidi@synergyprograms.com, and I'll make sure we follow up with you, because we are going to cover very rapidly this framework, but obviously there's a lot more detail, and we'll try to bring some additional videos to help have more conversation about these topics.
It's a great example of a non-conscious bias. Some people magnify threat, and some people magnify threat so largely that they catastrophize, or even if they don't, magnifying threat has enormous implications to everything.
Right.
Okay, so that's 2, conscious, non-conscious. And 4, thinking. We all know attention, memory, planning, emotion, the cues, which I've just mentioned. But feeling, so emotions are non-conscious. You pick up those cues in a fifth of a second, it's non-conscious, and they determine a huge amount of what you think is threatening or rewarding. And then at about a half a second, your body heart rate and sweat rate and breathing starts to change, and that's when you become aware of the consequences, your experience of the consequences of the perception of those cues, and that's feelings. So the feelings and emotions are completely different. Emotion cues, non-conscious, feelings, conscious, changes in your body physiology. And lastly, the 4th piece is your self-regulation, how well you regulate yourself, and negativity bias is one of those. If you have a negativity bias, you get a lot of trouble regulating yourself. You can magnify threat, you're going to be reactive. So there's an example of brain 1, safety first, brain 2, conscious, non-conscious, and 4, thinking, emotion, feeling, and self-regulation. And what we're seeing is peak performers, they get a model, whether it's that one or others. I don't for 1 minute pretend that model has a monopoly of wisdom on anything. It's just a distillation that I happen to do over 25 years with many collaborators around the world. And it summarizes literally about 1,000 models across scales and discipline. But there are others. And the point of it is not which model is right or wrong. Many things about the brain we have no clue about, like how does consciousness work. But this is a summary of the essence of how the brain might work. And the point is that I want to end off on for peak performers is when they come across a model that makes sense to them, they use it. So that's the first thing. Any issues on that, Heidi?
No issues. Of course, I have some opinions and some feedback that I'll share.
Yes.
It took a long time for me to keep my mouth shut. But no, I was relating even to my day today, and I was shocked at how often I hold my breath. So a peak performance situation, for example, maybe I'm getting ready to do a media interview or I'm getting ready to go on stage, and without that framework, I'm not really I might be thinking about tips that I've heard or strategies that I've used, but I don't know why they work. And so here I should have been relaxing. I wasn't. I was thinking about a bunch of things, and I could feel my breath tense up. And now with this framework, I'm able to recognize that I was sending a signal to my brain that I wasn't safe, that I wasn't getting the oxygen I needed. And then suddenly there was this cascade of other things that happened, but it really brings it all back to that very basic safety first. And I think with anything we do, whether it's our own performance, our physical energy, the energy we project to others, the environment that we create with the people that we're around, that safety first seems so simplistic, but it's so critical, and there are so many little things that we can do to use the cues that you were mentioning to help prime a positive situation, if that makes sense.
Spot on. Yeah. So to go to the second point on that, to take that as a segue to the second point, in terms of when you look at your scores, the 4 scores you'll be most aware of in the assessment of thinking, emotion, feeling, and self-regulation. If you take that example of safety first, the first thing you want to look at is, am I being hijacked by too much stress? Because if that's the case, all the rest is detail. Like, that's peak performers get that right. They master stress, and they know that that is like critical. And then the other thing that's intriguing is that peak performers kind of strive to get their scores, I call it aligned. It's kind of such intuitive and rational people in terms of their brains work in this integrated manner, that they know that getting the scores aligned is what makes for effectiveness in a model. that you can be a genius in terms of rational thinking, and you may be a great analyst, but it's very unlikely that you're going to be effective in dealing with all these other real-world personal and interpersonal dynamics. So the second point is that peak performers look to reconcile their scores rather than just getting high scores. And then they make sure that they master stress first. And then they look to the other elements they may want to master, like in memory. They'll use association techniques. In anything, they really do learn step by step that training new habits, you know, they know it. They know that it's small steps every day. They got a calmness. They really do stick to it. And they build things that help their effectiveness. They get the point of effectiveness, and they open, and they don't have natural non-conscious pushback if the idea is not theirs. Often, sometimes they do, but often. And so there's this kind of peak performance kind of openness to the model, and then looking for concrete evidence ways, monitorable, objective ways to show what's working for them, and bringing the pieces together more effectively for their own brains, making themselves more effective. So the other final example I want to give before I end up on my third point is they really get cues. So the first thing they get is the most important thing of the model, which is stress. But the second thing they get is this issue of emotion cues. Peak performers are kind of attuned to people's body language. They kind of they either know formally by now, because it's been in the scientific literature for about a decade and a half. But even before it was kind of well known, the peak performers I used to study, they kind of knew that body language was communicating something that was motivating, it was sort of like showing somebody's motivations as much, if not more so, as what they said. You know, these corridor conversations where I used to watch people and they'd say to the CEO or to a C-suite person or just to somebody else they work with, you know, really great job you did there. So good. And they'd be standing there with their arms folded, and you could just see that you didn't need to be an expert to know that there was a cognitive dissonance here. And that what people say is not always what it seems. But body language is much harder to fake. Authenticity is reflected in body language. And I'll end off in that point before I end off my third point, that everybody knows the example. That when somebody smiles at you, you automatically look to the corner of your eyes. And we did this research a long time ago. It's infrared technology. Every time somebody smiles at you, you look to the corner of their eyes to see if their eyes are crinkling. And if they are, the smile is authentic. And if they're not, it's not. But obviously, increasingly, you've got to look at the whole body and all the cues and pupil dilation and voice frequency and voice modularity.
I should be glad about these crow's feet showing up. It means I'm authentically really kind.
And we've gone on to world radio to tell people, be careful how you blot out your wrinkles, because just keep the corners of your eyes okay. But anyway. So
I could go on a whole tangent about that I'm going to skip about.
But I want to reconciliation and training.
Yeah. So two quick things about that. Number one, just to kind of brag on you a little bit more, I was fascinated when we were watching a sporting event and you mentioned that you had worked with, I believe it was the Australian rugby team, the national rugby team, and you were watching video and could predict with 90% success whether or not they were going to win or lose based on body language. I think there's been some tests done on that, and I think that's just marvelous. It'd be interesting to do that with teams of organizations. But the other piece is, for those who've taken the assessment or who are thinking about taking the assessment, I want to point out how important it is to look at reconciling the whole, because some of us tend to just focus on the negatives, or we give a score that looks like it's on a scale of 1 to 10, but it's really not. We won't go into the details about that, but the goal is how all of these dimensions really interact with each other and work as a system, which is why it's so helpful to work with a coach or someone to debrief the report with you, to help you understand exactly what you're looking at and not automatically think. People will say to me, well, my brain's really terrible because I'm a 5.5 or I'm a 6. That's actually not necessarily a bad thing. You're not looking to accomplish a 10 the way so many people often think about it.
It's such a good point. It's amazing. And people find their own way of doing it. There's no single way, but reconciling means also you want strategies where it's always useful from getting the dopamine hit. Everything about change is first get a win, get a dopamine hit, share it to someone, get some oxytocin bonding. So you may want to actually build a bit of a strength so that you literally, rising tide lifts all boats. So you may want to do it in that titrated way where you don't lose sight of your strength. That becomes the kind of contagion factor of success, of feeling cool about yourself, getting some dopamine going, getting some oxytocin going. They are the two ingredients of success. And then working on how to bring in the other scores that kind of lift up to get things kind of more. I just think about it. When I look at somebody's brain, I just think 85 billion highly interconnected neurons. How effectively are they using this with respect to the brain 1-4 model? And it's such an interesting thing to do. I've been doing it for a long time now, and it's like, when I hear all this psychobabble about people being a label, they're this and they're that, and they're passive aggressive and acting out, and narcissists and sociopaths. It's all, I mean, I'm sure there's, I'm a sort of, in addition to being medically trained and science specifically trained, I also do have a psychology background. And I mean, all of these things are helpful, like personality preferences. But when the closer you get to the brain and think about the brain dynamics, it's just the explanatory power, in my personal view and in the view of those in my network who are kind of practicing integrative neuroscientists, the explanatory power just becomes less kind of pejorative, and it just becomes, hey, this is just about somebody's brain. It's not a, we all have these dynamics, just in different proportions.
Right. Wonderful. Okay, so as always, we could talk about this for hours. Let's get to the third training tip that you have, which is really about, I found this fascinating, the ability to prioritize what's most important, and that you've seen that peak performers tend to do this naturally.
So this to me was really in terms of both decision makers, watching peak performers perform under pressure in work and in sport. And what occurred to me was, and in even pilots, I studied pilots, I had a course that I can't share too much about, but working with pilots that had incidents, and the other co-pilots had said that something's not right here, and it turned out that they'd violated this rule and had to be replaced. So the issue is this. It seems that peak performers so take on board this issue of having some sort of frame of reference, some sort of efficiency, clarity about how their strengths and limitations work, that here's the point. When something goes wrong, or I call it when they're in the moment at critical times, they immediately go to the biggest thing that they can solve in the moment. They just do it. They evaluate it like almost non-consciously. I don't know how they do it, but it seems like there's a pattern of consistency. They evaluate, what can I do with the panoply of options? And we know that we've trebled in brain size in our prefrontal cortex, from Australopithecus to Homo habilis to Homo erectus to us, to give us this ability. We can parallel process options in real time and choose the best ones. And it seems like peak performers are better at that. So they choose the best one that's going to have the most impact, and they do it. And then they do the second best one and the third best one. Now, non-peak performers can sometimes do the opposite. They go, oh, what's the thing that's really plugging this thing up? I mean, let me try and get over that hump. And that's why so many people specialize in the areas of greatest weakness. There's a lot of non-conscious bias and other dynamics in this. But the bottom line is peak performers prioritize. And I have no idea how they do it, but they do. And the data is there to show that they do. And then they just become increasingly effective by doing that. And I personally can see some link, tenuous as it might be, between having that model, reconciling the way that they have insight and use and always open to optimize their iterative capacities, and then bang, when the chips are down in the moment, at critical moments especially, they get it done.
I love it. I love it. And it's interesting. I think we're going to have to save this for another topic, but it makes me think of studies that have shown how much successful entrepreneurs in particular use intuition, whatever intuition is, and whether or not you can train your intuition. So some of the work I've been doing.
So I'm pretty sure that intuition is the ability to see the pattern of those cues, that it's not rational and it is not woolly. It's the ability to see the pattern. And the cues being a dominant, or from what we can see, a dominance of the ability to put those cues together, because those cues, the closer you get to the brain and the closer you get to where the brain decision making is happening, which is these non-conscious cues, the more you are able to be effective in the way that you can do this stuff, make these decisions. And of course, what we've been told is the opposite, that you should be rational.
Right.
And draw upon some, other intuitions. And it turns out that you need both, and probably in much more equal, if not, given that non-conscious cues happen first rather than the other way around. The cues and intuition become increasingly powerful. But I just want to say one final thing. Everybody knows that if you have too much of anything, too much emotion or get too reactive, of course that's not helpful. So everything comes back to effectiveness of the balance of the brain 1, 2, 4 dynamics. And it's situation and task dependent. And that's the nuance in this, that it's effectiveness is an easy thing to say. It's like alignment between people. It sounds so easy. It's incredibly difficult, and peak performers know that better than anybody.
And what we've talked about is really creating a model of adaptable effectiveness, that it's beyond just being effective. It's being effective when you need to. It's adjusting to circumstances. And as an entrepreneur, constantly changing circumstances, how important that actually is. And I'm going to open up this for a conversation. We're going to post this on YouTube. And I would encourage you, if you're watching this video and you have some feedback for us, to just post a comment. I'd love to hear how often you rely on intuition and whether or not that is something that you strategically train, because I think ultimately what we're looking at here is coming up with not only a model, but being able to train to reconcile the whole, and also being able to train those patterns of success, to be able to prioritize and to be able to trust your intuition. Just like training to be in the zone, the whole goal is that when you're there, you turn off the logical part and you trust what you know and you trust your training. So a lot of people think that I'm always pushing stress management because it's a passion of mine, but really learning that, increasing calm is such a key capacity for any type of peak performance. And that's also going to help with that safety first part of the model. So for me, probably one of the key takeaways is coming up with some sort of stress management, relaxation practice in all of this.
And that we do measure it. So I'm so glad you ended off with calm, because one of the measures that we can have whether people are getting into this flexible optimization is by measuring their heart rate variability, because we know that that's a reflection of your vagus 10th cranial nerve system, and it is when you're in your more sort of optimal iterative phase versus when you're in your fight, flight, hypothalamo, pituitary, adrenal, amygdala kind of system. Your heart rate is not variable. So we also increasingly are finding these measures, heart rate variability being one. There are also brain measures and sweat rate measures that we can also move towards measuring outcomes, because if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And that's where the model becomes really interesting, and having a platform to collect data, look at outcomes, and move beyond the anecdotes towards longitudinal scientific outcomes, which is what applied integrative neuroscience is all about for peak performance.
I love it. And I'm so grateful to be part of this applied integrative neuroscience movement with you and your team at My Brain Solutions. So I want to end with this again. For those of you who've taken the assessment, and for those of you who haven't taken it yet, what we did was we actually bundled the assessment with training. So for those of you who are part of EO and you're doing the research study, when you do that initial assessment, you also have access to I believe it's 90 days of training with My Brain Solutions, and you can go back in and reassess and see how that's working, because one of the most important things and the model that My Brain Solutions built is to assess, train, and monitor so that we can see what's working, and we can also help coach you through that process as well. And so when we're talking about heart rate variability, one of the training tools for that that's included in that training platform is called MyCombi. And I would encourage you to download the app as well. You can use that on your iPhone or your iPad. And there's also a monitor that you can purchase that will help you to determine your best breathing rate. So again, we can go into details about all the different great technologies and additional resources that are there, but I do want to keep the video short and provide you with some training tools, some takeaways. If you want more information, you have my contact, it's Heidi@synergyprograms.com. I can also put you directly in touch with Evian, who's going to also be going out with me on a speaking tour, although the dates are still to be determined, but we are going to go out and be doing some speaking on this new peak performance presentation and releasing his soon-to-be published new book. So we will make sure to keep in touch with you. Send me a note if you want to know when that book is coming out. Other than that, any kind of final takeaways? Just as a recap, we said have a brain framework, reconcile the whole, learn for patterns of success. Any last thoughts from you, Evian?
No, you've just been it's been a wonderful interaction, and I think we've covered the 3 points we wanted to cover. And there's nothing more fun than dealing with peak performers.
That's right. Okay, so if there are topics you want to hear more about, also post that in the comment section below. I believe this is going to be the first of many of these discussions. So we look forward to sharing more information with you, and thank you again for spending your time and energy with us. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too. Bye.